Okay, this is the chapter 5 lecture on language. So, I really want you guys, before we start this, to be comfortable with the concepts that we covered in the first 4 chapters because now when we get to language, we're going to actually employ a lot of those concepts and see how they're operationalized. So, I also lied. I guess my lectures are not going to be 15 to 20 minutes. As you guys saw, chapter 4 was about a half hour, but if I need to do that to convey the information that I think is important to you, I'm sorry. I mean, it's only 10 more minutes, but I know that I said they'd be 15 to 20, but it's very hard to disseminate all that information in that short time. So that being said, we are going to skip around in chapter 5 today. So chapter 5 deals with languages, right? And so according to your book, you have the key issues that are broken down by how we're going to examine languages through the material. So where are the world's languages distributed? Where did English and related languages originate and diffuse? Why do individual languages vary among places? And lastly, why do local languages survive? And so I'm not going to spend too much time on key issue 4. That'll be your responsibility. I'm really going to go through the first 3. So first and foremost, what is a language? It's a system of communication through either speech, sounds, or people that understand each other and have the same meaning. So an important part of culture is language, right? The system of communication that's vital to any kind of culture or language. So that was covered in chapter 1. And again, those two main parts of culture, right? The values and their tangible artifacts. So what does that mean, tangible artifact? If we just look back at chapter 4, we talked about cultural landscapes, right? And the actual physical representation of culture on the landscape. And if you remember some of the things that those included, right? We have signs, people, food, clothing, right? So there's a ton of tangible artifacts reflected in culture as well as language. So where are the world's languages distributed? So in order to kind of help us conceptualize this, we break up languages into families, right? And so we're going to particularly focus on 2 of the largest language families, but there are other, big ones too. So let's see quickly how this is kind of organized. So we have a language family, and what that is pretty much a collection of languages related through some common ancestral language, right, that existed long before recorded history. So it's going to help you to conceptualize language. Let me move this slide up. Okay. So we can think of language families, right, on here as the trunk, the biggest part. Right? Then we have the language branch, which is what you see here, so, right, stemming off of the trunk. And a language branch is a collection of languages within a family. So remember now there's different families, and then within those families you have the branches. So it's a collection of languages within a family related through, again, a common ancestral language that existed several thousand years ago. But the differences, right, within that same language family now, the branches, are not as big or as old as between language families. So again, there's less variation within the same language family, right? It's the same way if you want to think about it like a family of 4 people, right? The differences between them are not as different as the differences between families. And lastly, we have a language group, which we can think of as the leaves, right? And so a language group is also a collection of languages within the branch. So remember, branches are within families, and then groups are within the branches, right? And so it's a collection of languages within a branch that share a common origin, or hearth, right, from chapter 4, in the relatively recent past, and display many similarities in grammar and vocabulary. So the biggest differences we're expecting, between families, right? But now, if we look within that one trunk, which, remember, the trunk here is a family, right? The higher up you go, yes, the more, dialects and languages that are separated, but they all have common ancestry to the one hearth language, right? And we'll get into the hearth languages in a second. So languages move with speakers and they develop in isolation, right? So now we just covered folk and pop culture in chapter 4. So when we're talking about language moving, let's think about how they move differently in places dominated by folk and pop culture. So languages may be institutional, they may be developing, they may be vigorous, or in trouble or dying. So don't worry, we're going to cover those 4, right after this. But again, the main idea here is that how they're organized, right? Families, trunk, branches, and then groups, we think about them as leaves. So what is an institutionalized language? That just simply means that that specific language is used in work, mass media, education, and government. So many countries designate at least one institutional language as an official language. The United States does not have an official language, but its de facto has been English, right? And so the official language is used by the government for laws, which, although again, not a official language in the US, the de facto language used in public records and law in the United States is English. Reports and public objects, right, such as money, road signs, and stamps. Those are all in English too in the United States. So if we think about that, it makes sense that official languages would be understood by the majority of citizens, right? But some countries, that were colonized by England designate English as the official language. And some countries have more than one official language, especially those that have been colonized, which require all public documents to be in all of the official languages. So for example, if a country has an institutionalized language, which most of them only have one, but if they have an institutionalized language, that means that both, money and media and government and all the laws and public records have to be in both languages if it's institutionalized, right? Which means it's widely accepted and understood by the majority of people living in a country. Right? And here's some examples of French Quebec, right? The majority of people there speak French, and so the French language, in addition to English, has been institutionalized, which is why we see stop signs, right? And also French and English. But what about developing and vigorous languages? So developing languages are spoken in daily use by people, all ages, right? But they have a literary translation. So although the literature in the language may not be widely distributed, what people are saying can actually be translated, right, from another language. Now, how is that different from a vigorous language? A vigorous language is spoken in daily use again, but it lacks a literary translation. There's nothing to translate that into another language. For example, right, we have this graphic down here, the complete how to speak Southern guide. Now, again, I'm not from Texas, right? So when I came here from New Jersey and I heard someone tell me, "Oh, bless his heart," I thought that was a nice thing to say. But then when I found out what "bless your heart" really means, it's kind of just like, "Oh, he doesn't understand," or "Oh, he's not smart," right? I'm putting it more soft than I think the actual translation down here is, but you get the idea, right? There's no way to translate "bless your heart" into another language. So we also talked about hearths and pop culture, right? Especially music and how music spreads. The same kind of thing talks about or applies to languages, right? So if we use Indonesia as an example, right, the solid magenta or pink colors, right, are countries that have originated a language, and then the purple arrows are where those speakers have migrated to or where they've moved to, right? Or another way to think about that, where they've relocated to, right? Relocation diffusion. But the origin of a language, we're getting to the hearth, right? This might be confusing to some people. So the more diverse sounds in a language are closer to the hearth. And diversity and sounds and dialects decreases as you move away from the hearth. Why? Well, let's try to think about this as a metaphor, right? Language origins can be thought of like cities. And so a city is made up of more people speaking more languages from more backgrounds, right? Different types of culture, different types of ethnicities. And as you move away from cities, right, into suburban areas, rural areas, it tends to become more homogeneous. There's not as much diversity. right? And the same thing here applies to languages as you move away from hertz. So again, these are all about the language families and their distributions. And the following graphics illustrate how you go from the branch, or excuse me, the trunk to the branch, uh, to the group or the leaf, right? I'm not going to spend too much time on that. You guys can cover that. What I really want to get to here is how, again, now, so we're talking about diffusion, right? And how languages spread, and not only what happens when they spread, but also, what the result is, right? And so sometimes the result over long periods of time has been institutionalized languages. But we talked about contagious diffusion, how something just becomes popular for cultural or social reasons. But language in particular has predominantly spread through hierarchical diffusion. And remember, again, hierarchical diffusion means through power. And so what figure 2.2 here, also in your textbook, is illustrating is the nomadic warrior theory, right? And so originally the group known as the Kurgans were the original speakers of the Indo-European language. And as they've branched out and conquered nearby areas, they've implemented, right, and mandated that be the language used and maybe institutionalized, right? We see how language is implemented in cultural landscapes. So cafe death pork, right? I speak Spanglish 7 días a week and 24 hours al day, or it should be dia, but whatever, right? You get the idea. So combining languages is also popular, especially when you have two predominant languages in an area, right? It just happens that, in Quebec, that French happens to be institutionalized. And, even if you look in parts in Texas, there are, predominantly only Spanish being spoken, and yet still a lot of the signs are still in English. And lastly, I just want to cover dialects. So why do individual languages vary among places, right? Well, dialects are different. The US has its own different dialects. How do we tell if something's a dialect or a language, right? And what about multilingual places? So this is just a cool graphic that illustrates what something is called in the UK versus what it's said in the US. So for example, in the UK, they call a truck a lorry, right? They call the trunk of your car a boot. An amber traffic light is saying yellow light. Gearbox, transmission. Petrol is gas, and that makes sense, right? Petroleum. Number plate, license plate. So you get the idea, but that's the same English language, right? But it's just a different dialect. And so 3.1, right, is dialects and subdialects within England. And so we see here on the left, medieval languages. So Old English and Celtic, right? So Old English is predominantly through the bigger island of the UK and on the east. And as you move into Wales and the north, it's Celtic. Now, within that, right, we have regional dialects that vary. So in the middle, I guess the southern middle of the Midlands, they call it, has a different dialect in the north and versus the south. And if you want to think about this in terms of the United States and try to transplant that, it's how, maybe people from the north or people from the west coast have an accent that might be different, or how the south has a unique accent, right? So let's look quickly at language diversity, right? And this just happens to be an example of Switzerland. So Switzerland has 4 official languages, right? German, French, Italian, and Romansh. But what does that mean then? It means that those languages, right, all public records and documents and signs have to be in these 4 languages. So as we're moving through, right, we have, different examples of language diversity. And if I was to ask you, on an exam for extra credit, how many languages does Switzerland officially have? You would say what? 4. Okay. And so the rest of this you can go through on your own. It's pretty straightforward, but a really cool resource if you're interested in languages or want to know how many dialects and, subdialects exist throughout the world. There's a website called Ethnologue, and they research almost 7,100 living languages, not the ones that are not spoken anymore. It's kind of the ultimate source, right, for the world's languages. So there's a link there if you want to check that out. And again, I'm going to create a discussion thread for chapter 5. And hopefully this was easier to conceptualize, especially focusing on the language branches, families, and groups, and how they're kind of organized. And very quickly, what I almost missed here that I did want to cover, the result of hierarchical diffusion, if I can find the slide, yes. So Indo-European is spoken by the language family, right, the trunk. From that trunk, almost 50% of all languages spoken contemporarily come from this one family. And now about 20% come from Sino-Tibetan. So if I was to ask you the biggest language families, right, the two biggest trunks, you would say Indo-European and Sino-Tibetan. And then from there, knowing that these are the two large language families, you can see how it branches out and how it gets into groups and how it's been spread over time. So check out Ethnologue. It's a really cool resource. And I look forward to talking about chapter 6.